So welcome to the Canadian Chamber's introductory podcast for the Resources of the Future campaign. Just to kind of give listeners sort of an overview of what the campaign is we've really been focused on thinking about how the resource sector plays a vital role in Canada's economy. In particular, that involves thinking about the role that the resource sector plays in creating economic value, ties to Indigenous communities, and driving forward new technologies. But it's also really trying to think about how all of these industries become connected to larger webs of economic activity. So connecting SMEs and value chains throughout Canada and really sort of highlighting the role that the resource sector plays in pushing those forward. Today, to launch off this series, and we'll have a series of podcasts coming into play over the next weeks and months, I'm joined by Dr. Trevin Stratton, Chief Economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So Trevin, to get this conversation rolling, we're hearing a lot about how the old economy is changing and that digitalization is taking shape across a number of different industries. In sort of your opinion and how you sort of analyze this, how does this come to play with the resource sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there's a lot of talk recently about, the difference between the old economy that might be in some of the sectors that came up, in earlier industrial revolutions, whether it was manufacturing, energy industry, mining, agriculture, et cetera. And a lot of these are, blue chip companies. Larger. Their growth is in some ways driven by technology, but in some ways it's just driven by efficiencies and the actual tangible products that they produce. Versus a new economy, right? Some people call this a knowledge economy or the intangible economy, where growth is in many ways driven by technology and skills and intangible assets like brands. When I think about these things, I think that it's a false dichotomy to think about it in these ways, whether there's an old economy and a new economy. Really, to me, there's just the economy, and it's constantly evolving based on new technologies and innovation. Right, it's a horizontal that cuts across sector verticals, and that includes proverbial old economy industries like energy and manufacturing, natural resources, because there's some incredible innovations taking place in these sectors themselves. Right, when it comes to agriculture, there's precision agriculture, smart mining. When it comes to the natural resources industry, there's a lot of really interesting 3D visualization going on in the energy industry and sensors on pipelines. And so these industries and these sectors are very much part of the so-called new economy, and there's a lot of innovation and technology being applied in them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that kind of challenging that distinction between old and new, I think is really important. And I think this is something that will come up as we go forward with this podcast series, is that, increasingly we are seeing that in the Canadian economy, one key site of both developing, adapting, and scaling new technologies is the resource sector. And some of those examples that you've just mentioned, are really good ones. And I think that really tells us a couple of important things. On the one hand, it tells us that if we want to think about moving towards using more high technologies, embracing digitalization, then the resource sector has to be part of that equation, because it is, one of our largest sectors in the Canadian economy, and it drives innovation in really startling ways. The other thing to be considered too is just how nested the resource economy is with local economies and with economies across Canada. And so I think that's something we're really hoping to tie together in this podcast series, is just the interdependencies. There is a really strong connection between the resource sector and small to medium businesses and communities. I think that actually kind of really gets us back to what's the underlying purpose of the Resources of the Future campaign. It's on the one hand that we're going to be sort of developing a series of episodes with different kind of leaders across Canada, thinking about both what does it look like as the resource sector gets engaged in digitalization, but really what does it also mean to be thinking about the resource sector as something that is connected to all these small to medium businesses, and how do we actually start to position ourselves as a country to take advantage of these interdependencies and to essentially leverage them to continue economic growth, continue job creation, and continue that we're developing these technologies that are going to be key to sustainability and key to sort of allowing us to continue to move towards our emission targets.
To me, there is no path to a more sustainable Canada without having a huge role for the energy industry in it, and investment in the slow transformation of the jobs that are going to be available.
Going back to that, I think that we've already established that how new technologies are developed and deployed are going to have a really interesting impact on the resource sector. That should be a key focus for us going forward. But the other question too is really, it comes down to emissions. And I think this actually, again, makes Canada's resource sector a really interesting site of policy debate. We're recording this on October 1st. Climate change is top of mind for the moment in terms of the federal election. And so the question that I think a lot of Canadians want to know and that they're curious about is, what can the role be of Canada's resource sector in reducing emissions, both domestically but also internationally?
In terms of when we think about an economic strategy for Canada nationally, I think for any country, it is very important for them to focus on what their competitive advantages are. Our competitive advantage, one way at least, has definitely been natural resources for almost the entire history of our nation and our geography. And that's not going away, despite all the changes that are taking place in, for instance, our natural resource sectors. It's all about ensuring that those sectors continue to be competitive going forward by implementing some of these new technologies and really embracing and harnessing some of the changes that are taking place because of new technologies. But yeah, I think absolutely there's a huge role for the industry to play in reducing Canada's emissions. And it's already taking place too, right? I mean, some of the largest institutional investors in renewable energy are from our natural resources sector, right? It's not all new startups coming up. A lot of it is kind of new technologies being implemented in our existing and competitive companies. And it's very important that we keep that in mind. I also think it's really important that we keep in mind that this isn't going to take place overnight, right? We're going to need, somewhere between kind of $50 and $100 billion invested in these industries to actually transform them to reach our goals when it comes to emissions. And there are certain things that there aren't replacements for anymore, right now at least, like jet fuel being one example. And so it's all about, figuring out the transition itself rather than saying, well, the energy industry will no longer be competitive anymore. The energy industry means a lot of different things, including, renewable sources of energy too. And I think you make a very good point when it comes to global emissions too. Canada is, well, you might know better than me, Aaron. What is it, 1.4% global emissions? 1.6?
About 1.5.
1.5. I was right in the middle. But there are a lot of countries that are developing around the world, particularly in Asia. They're growing quite quickly, and energy demand is projected to continue to increase going forward. If we're able to get our energy resources to world markets, we can actually make a very big dent in global emissions by displacing coal in some of these countries too. And so, I think it's very important to keep in mind that big picture as well.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and this actually plays into these larger international tectonic movements in terms of, who commands energy and where the demand's coming from. And just to kind of contextualize that, at the moment in sort of one of the most recent International Energy Agency reports, it noted that at the moment, Asia makes up half of global growth in natural gas, 60% in the rise of wind and solar power, more than 90% of the increase in oil, and more than 100% of the growth in coal and nuclear. And the reason for that is because generally nuclear, for a number of reasons, but coal has continued to decline elsewhere. And so I think this is when we're talking about these global energy dynamics and these demands, it becomes a really interesting question about, what kind of energy products can we supply these new economies or these emerging economies so that they can continue to sort of temper their emissions and we don't see a global uptick. But the other question too, and you kind of pointed to it, is that, we have a lot of other things that aren't necessarily energy products, but are associated with energy products. So things like carbon capture and storage, carbon scrubbing, methane capture, all these are technologies that are, being developed by Canada's energy sector. And they obviously deliver, considerable returns in reducing our own intensity of emissions per barrel here. But those are also things that we can export to emerging economies to kind of combat emissions there.
Large energy corporations that are doing a great job at investing in what they need to do for this transition. There are also a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that are part of the supply chain too, and that have a huge economic impact on their local communities, that create a number of jobs that are also being impacted by some of these changes too, and it's important we keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of this really rich ecosystem that surrounds Canada's resource sector. And, it isn't simply about agriculture. It isn't simply about mining. It's not simply about forestry or it's simply about energy. It's actually the communities connected to all of those sectors and the value chains that, run through them, all the way literally that you can kind of map out connections between the energy companies operating in Alberta and manufacturing in Ontario, right? That there's a value chain that runs all the way through.
The natural resources industry, but in all industries, right? We're talking in a lot of ways of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And a lot of that is being able to collect data on our physical environment. And when we're talking about our natural resources industry, that is part of the future too, right? It's part of this data economy, and it's part of being able to do that. And, when we talk about having high-speed broadband in all areas of Canada, this is going to be integral for actually being able to have a competitive resources industry in the future too, right? It certainly has to do with energy, with mining, with forestry, with agriculture, and being able to collect that data and to have our businesses operate and use that data to improve their efficiencies, to improve their productivity, also to reduce their emissions is going to be one of the keys moving forward.
What will have to be a focus point, as we continue to think about these ways these different themes play within the sector. It's one thing that's recurrent is that for both these communities, for these SMEs, and for these larger established companies in the resource sector to really take advantage of these innovations, it's going to require rethinking and really engaging with our regulatory system, right, in such a way that actually allows for these firms to scale and adapt these technologies as they come into kind of fruition, right? And I think that's a real concern, is that there is the potential there for the technological capacity to be in place, but for our companies not to be positioned or advantaged by Canada's regulatory system to do so.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I mean, when it comes to regulatory competitiveness, that's probably one of the biggest issues in overall Canadian competitiveness right now. We really saw that come to a head if we're talking about the TMX expansion as well. And, apart from being able to get our resources to world markets and how that's useful, I think it's also important to keep in mind the psychological impact on investors of that not getting built, right? Because here you had a company that thought that it had jumped through all the hoops, and then they still couldn't get built what they were planning. And, hopefully it still happens. But for investors, they look at this and the word uncertainty is thrown about quite often. And that's what they see. If I want to build something in Canada, am I going to be able to get it built? And I think that's an important impact of being able to get our resources to global markets, apart from just getting global prices and being able to reduce global emissions, is also that psychological impact for investors too. That uncertainty is still impacting our economy, and it's continued to at least be there, if not grow, since that issue took place. And I mean, I was looking at the GDP numbers this morning, and first of all, our growth was flat for the most recent numbers that came out as of today, October 1st, which were from July. But oil and gas extraction was down 4.7%, right? And this is the largest monthly decline in a decade. Both natural gas and oil extraction were down. And so, these are pretty important issues for the viability of our entire national economy going forward.
I think, though, this again gets back to this question about investor confidence and sort of spurring development, because at the moment there is considerable demand for both oil and natural gas coming out of the Asian economies. We kind of had said that from the very outset. And so part of this question then becomes, I think for a lot of people, and we really honest about this, people are very anxious about climate change. They're very concerned about our fossil fuel sector, and they see sort of a decline in terms of both those numbers probably as a positive thing. And I think that, again, gets to the heart of this question, is that, really we are still looking at a global demand that's ticking up for all of these resources. And so then the question really does become, how can you strategically meet that demand? Can you do it in a way that you have both technologies being utilized to capture as much carbon as possible, reduce energy intensity or emission intensity per barrel as possible, as well as just thinking about the opportunities for something like liquefied natural gas to reduce emissions in emerging economies that are currently using coal. So I think this is kind of this question about these different ways in which what we do have, how that fits with global energy infrastructure is really important. And I think it's also very important to have a very honest and open discussion about timelines to make these things happen. Because I think, a lot of people feel that they'd like to turn the taps off overnight. And it's, there's a whole series, there's an economic argument as to why that would be imprudent, but there's also simply just a reality argument that doesn't actually allow that to be the case.
That's a really good point. And, it's a particular affliction of our current political state, not only in Canada, but everywhere, where politics is very polarized. And, it's not as black and white as, oil is bad and green energy is good. I mean, it's quite nuanced. And, the energy industry in Canada, as we've mentioned, are doing a lot of things when it comes to renewables. And vice versa. A lot of renewables companies are also very much involved in the traditional oil and gas sector. And, that might not fit in however many characters are in a tweet, but it's a bit more of a complex idea and position to put forward. But that's the reality of it, is that, it's not going to go away overnight, nor should it. And that it's all about the timeline and the transition and how we can all work together to actually achieve both our environmental goals and our economic goals.
We'll leave it at that with those final words from Dr. Trevin Stratton, Chief Economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to tune into our next episode, which features the Halfway River Group and ConocoPhillips as Chief Darlene Hunter discusses the importance of relationship building, ongoing dialogue, and her vision for her community and the resource sector in the years ahead. And please don't forget to check out our website for updates and new podcast episodes at rotf.ca. If you want to continue to add support to this conversation, please feel free to share this episode on social media and maybe consider using some of these hashtags. Hashtag ROTF, hashtag Resource Champions, hashtag Canada's Natural Advantage. But we also look forward to seeing whatever you come up with as well. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to having you in the conversation in the future.